We'll get started. We'll see how this comes out with no glasses. Lynn said, well, just wear your sunglasses. Those aren't bifocals. All right. We're now in chapter 20 of 2 Samuel. Who can tell me what's just happened before we start talking about what's about to happen? You remember Absalom?
David said, morning, old Absalom.
Yeah, and Joab said, get off your keister and get out here and greet your guys, and right? And he did.
Restore confidence in people.
Right. What we didn't cover at the end of chapter 19 is the argument that arose between the northern tribes and the tribe of Judah. Right? The northern tribes, they're arguing, we were the first one to accept David back, so we got a bigger part of David than you do. And they're like, no, he's from the tribe of Judah. He's all ours, da-da-da-da-da. And it became quite an intense argument. So this split that started initially when, David was becoming king in Judah, first, right, in Hebron, and the northern 10 tribes, of course, Saul's now dead, so they're figuring out what's next, and most of them knew that David had been anointed the new king of Israel, but we end up with a civil war, right? It went on for a couple of years, and finally, Judah won, and they all became one, and David became king of everybody, da-da-da-da-da, right? But now we got to deal with Absalom, and when he's trying to come back to Jerusalem, Judah was the last one to accept him back, because they had aligned themselves with Absalom. But they decided, it's David, he's anointed, da-da-da-da-da. And then, but they get in this big feud, right, on the way back. And it tells us that in verse 1 to 20, now a worthless fellow happened to be there whose name was Sheba, the son of Bishri. I forget how to pronounce it. You notice it says a Benjaminite. And he blew the trumpet and said, we have no portion with David, nor do we have inheritance in the son of Jesse, every man to his tent, O Israel. So he's telling these northern tribes, we're rebelling, we're separating, David's not our king. So after this big argument, a lot of the people in the north are like, okay, that sounds good to me. Right? But it's interesting that what God points out, first off, it says he's a worthless fellow. Right? Right off the bat. Before you even get his name. Okay? And going from memory, because I can't read my notes, that the Hebrew word for worthless means man of Belial, Belial, right? Which later became associated with Satan. At this time, it wasn't directly associated with Satan, but it meant somebody who was not good, right? And so the implication, when this is actually written, right, is that this guy really was not a good dude. Okay?
I translate uses the word rebel.
Rebel? Well, he was.
Troublemaker.
Troublemaker, yeah. That's a good description, right? And so, now what's the Bible say about David? First thing you think of when you think of David, what does the Bible say? A man after God's very own heart, right? But this guy, the word is, he's worthless, right? So he's a troublemaker, and he's trying to make trouble, right? And starts another, basically, revolt against David, right? So he's calling for the northern 10 tribes to rebel against David, right, and against Judah, okay? What's interesting is this is almost word for word what the Bible says later, when the northern 10 separate after Solomon's death, right, and Rehoboam becomes king, and Jehoboam becomes king in the northern, right? This is exactly what it says. So this is a phrase that was used to mean, let's revolt. Let's separate, right? So this whole separation thing is not something that goes away easy, right? And one of the things I want you to think about as we go through this, when Absalom was rebelling, right, starting with the way he sat at the gates and talked to the people, etc., right, you know, and how did David react to how he's reacting with this rebellion with Sheba, right? Because he says in verse 2, so all the men of Israel withdrew from following David and followed Sheba, the son of Bichri, whatever it is. But the men of Judah remained steadfast to the king from the Jordan even to Jerusalem, right? So the last ones to accept him back are now truly aligned with him again. Because it's kind of like the bigger enemy was the northern 10 tribes versus David, right? You know, they were ready to leave David and join Absalom, okay? But they're sure not going to join Israel against David. You know, when you think about the politics and you think about all the stuff that goes on today and how people react and what, you know, how they align themselves and whatnot, you know, it's just like, boy, people are dumb. You know, right? And, but in David, you know, came to his house at Jerusalem, right? And the king took the 10 women, the concubines, whom he had left to keep the house, and placed them under guard, and provided them with subsistence, but he did not go into them, so they were shut up until the day of their death, living as widows.
It's kind of harsh, isn't it?
I think so. I mean, whose fault was it that this happened? Was it their fault?
David's.
More David than anybody, and then Absalom, and he's dead, right? There wasn't. Did they have a choice? If Absalom is, quote, the new king, and David has left, right? You know, and yet he decides that he's never going to go see them. Of course, he had how many women he wanted, right? He didn't need them or anything. But I think that was a little harsh. Not to. I mean, if you don't want them anymore, at least make them available to be wives for somebody else, right? I'm sure there are other men that would have taken them, but nonetheless, I thought it was kind of harsh. So you look at David's reactions to things, right? And the last part of his life, you know, these decisions he's making now, right, are frequently questionable, right? So then the king said to Amasa, call out the men of Judah, for within 3 days, and be present here yourself. So he says, who's Amasa? You remember him? He was the commander of the army for Absalom. And David said, in order to reconcile the tribes, he said, I'll make you commander over all the army instead of Joab. And why did he do that? Not really for reconciliation, although politically that made a little bit of sense, right? But because he despised Joab for killing Absalom. Right? So he really wanted to punish Joab. Okay? But if you think about it, first off, this guy is the commander of the army that was defeated. So his ability to command is certainly in question. And secondly, he says, go get men from Judah. They don't like this dude. Right? And third, as a commander of the army of Absalom against David, how do you know he has any allegiance to you? At all. So again, a very questionable appointment. Right? And the very next verse, so Amasa went out to call out the men of Judah, but he delayed longer than the set time, the 3 days, which had been appointed him. So then you got to wonder why. Did he just fail? Was he incapable? Or was he wanting to give Sheba time to get away? We don't know, right? But one of the three, because he obviously failed. Now, whether he failed on purpose, we don't know. Okay? And David said to Abishai, now Sheba, the son of Bichri, will do us more harm than Absalom. So take your Lord's servants and pursue him, lest he find for himself fortified cities and escape, from our sight. Okay? So, he's still not calling Joab, is he? But he's calling Joab's brother. Okay?
Holding a grudge.
Oh, big time. So bad that later, one of his last things was to tell Solomon to kill Joab. If he thought Joab needed to be killed, why didn't he just do it? Or have it done, right? Why push it off onto Solomon? Of course, by that time, Joab's getting to be up in the years a little bit too, right? But nonetheless, he never actually forgives Joab, does he? Now, but the next verse, so Joab's men went out after him. Right? Because you remember, Abishai is Joab's brother, right? So Joab's men, and along with these other guys, they go out after Sheba. And on the way, what happens? When Joab meets Amasa, what happens?
The sword falls on the ground.
He kills him.
Yeah. Joab went to embrace him and
Gutted
took
him.
the sword without him knowing and stabbed him.
Gutted him, yeah. I mean, the Bible's pretty clear. It says he made all his innards fall out. Right? Yeah. So.
Like field dressing a deer.
Yeah. And that's down in verse 10, right? And so he fell to the ground and died, and Joab and Abishai, his brother, pursued Sheba, right? And they just left the guy laying there bleeding and, dead and all that, and everybody had to go by him. And some guy came along and moved him out of the way off the highway, covered him up, right? But now Sheba gets to this town. It says in verse 14 that he goes through all the tribes of Israel to Abel, even to Beth Maacah, and all the Berites, and they gathered together and also went after him, right? So it appears that for the most part, the only people with Sheba were these people called the Berites, which might be just a different spelling for his father's name. So these could be predominantly family members, right? We don't know that though. So they catch him at this Abel Beth Maacah, and they cast up a mound against the city, right? And it stood by the rampart, and all the people who were with Joab were wrecking destruction in order to topple the wall, right? So they're getting ready to break the wall, to break into the city. And one of the problems when you're sieging a city, right, a walled city, is that people up on the wall can shoot arrows down at you, throw stones at you, etc. And here you are trying to get up close to the wall to do your work, right? So once you get through, what do?
Destroy the city.
You just go after everybody, right? After all, you're a soldier and they've been trying to kill you. You don't know which ones they were, so I mean, it's mass destruction, property and people, right? Okay? Now, the people in this city are not big supporters of Sheba. He just come in and kind of took over, right? So we have occasion here, if you think about women in the Old Testament, how were women treated back then?
Second class.
For the most part.
Property.
Yeah, for the most part, they're really, but occasionally we have somebody that stands out,
Right.
right? Somebody that even becomes a prophetess. And somebody that the commander of the army won't even go to battle unless she goes with him. And in this case, we have a woman, right? A wise woman. Unlike, what did it say about Sheba? A worthless, right? This worthless fellow, contrasted here with a wise woman, right? So again, all of the feminazis that don't want to recognize how the Bible actually describes women, right? Here you have a contrast where this woman is a whole lot better than this guy was, right? This wise woman, she called from the city and asked for Joab.
So they know who's coming.
Yeah.
Who's leading the army.
How did they know it was Joab? It wasn't Joab that was sent, right?
Right.
First it was Amasa, and then it was Abishai. But it's Joab leading the army. Now, it could be that they didn't know that Amasa had been appointed. Certainly didn't know that he was now dead, right? They didn't have text messages. And Joab had led the army before, so maybe that's why they assumed it was Joab. Which it was, right? However, she knew. And so she calls for Joab, and he comes, and says, "Are you Joab?" And he answered in verse 17, "I am." Then she said, "Listen to the words of your maidservant." And he answered and said, "I am listening." That's all he said. He said, "I'm not trusting you. I'm not coming out from under whatever cover I've got to keep people from shooting me, right? With arrows and whatnot, But I'll listen to you." And she spoke, saying, "Formerly they used to say, they will surely ask advice at Abel." And thus they ended the dispute. So people would go to this town to get advice. When you had a dispute, you would go there to get advice from somebody who would say, "Oh, well, this is really what you guys need to do. You do this, and everybody, oh, okay, right?" And it had a reputation for that kind of wisdom, right? And of course, we've got the quote wise woman, right? Even the women are wise in Abel, right? And she says, "I am," in verse 19, "of those who are peaceable and faithful in Israel. You are seeking to destroy a city, even a mother in Israel. Why would you swallow up the inheritance of the Lord?" When they crossed the Jordan, the land was distributed, right, to different people. It's the tribes and then people, etc. So she's like, this was given to Abel way back. And now you're wanting to destroy it? God gave it to Abel. Why do you have the right to destroy it, right? So she's questioning his logic in what he's attempting to do, because he's about to wipe this place out, right? And Joab answered and said, far be it from me that I should swallow up and destroy. Right? It says, it's not what I want to do. You know what I want, Sheba. Right? And verse 21 says, such is not the case, but a man from the hill country of Ephraim, Sheba, the son of Bichri by name, has lifted up his hand against King David. Only hand him over, and I will depart from the city. And the woman said to Joab, behold, his head will be thrown to you over the wall. She says, no problem. We'll take care of that.
Yeah.
Right?
Did I miss it? Did they ever name this woman?
Nope.
No.
They never did.
Never gave her name. Just the wise woman from Abel.
Okay.
Yeah. Right?
Apparently they didn't want to give her too much credit.
But on that, she's telling him, think about what you're doing. And he said, look, all I want is Sheba. And she says, fine, we can finish this. So in terms of solving the problem and not having a whole bunch of people get killed unnecessarily, right? Now, Joab had killed other people that got in his way, right? But he was always,
He probably had a reputation.
yeah, but he was always faithful to David, and we don't have any talk of him killing civilians. Right? So she probably assumed that she could negotiate with him, right? Like I said, she was a wise woman. She had figured this thing out. And she knew before she talked to Joab what he wanted, because she knew who had come into the city and closed up the walls, right? The doors and all that, and hiding out. So she now, then the woman wisely, the wise woman wisely came to all the people. So she went back to like the city council, right? And was able to, I was wondering if Sheba's running the show in the town, how in the world is she able to yell over the wall at Joab? He apparently didn't run the whole show in town, right? So she goes to the town council, for lack of better words, and says, well, unless you want to die and all your children die, right, we need to get rid of this Sheba guy, and then Joab will go away. All we got to do is chop that dude's head off, throw it over the wall.
Didn't he have his own little army with him?
He had his apparently it was a little army, like it
Yeah.
says. Remember the Berites up here?
Yeah.
That maybe were family members, but he didn't have enough guys to overpower the rest of the city, however many people were in the city, right? I'm sure it wasn't like 1 million, but it might have been 10,000, right? So anyway, they overpower him, and they kill him, throw his head over the wall. Joab says, thank you very much, and heads back to Jerusalem.
Man of his word.
Called it off. So both she and he kept their word and stopped that whole deal, right? Now, one more thing to point out that's not in the lesson is, after this, we have this list of the important people in Israel. Very similar to the list that's in chapter 8. But there are 3 differences. One of them is David's sons are now not listed as priests, but they had been listed before, right? We have a new officer. Adoram is now head of the, quote, forced labor. So we know Solomon used forced labor in his building projects, right? But apparently the whole thing started here with David, because we even have an officer that's over the forced labor. And the other thing that's not quite so obvious is this list of all the important people in Israel did not include David, like chapter 8 did. And it's quite a significant difference in the sense of, in chapter 8, verse 15, David reigned over all Israel, and David administered justice and righteousness for all his people. That's chapter 8. In chapter 20, he's not even listed. Interesting, isn't it? There's a change. A change going on, right? Any questions or comments on our endeavors to understand David? You know, but when you have conflicts, if you ask God about it, and He gives you wisdom and says, here's the way to handle it. Because what does the Bible say about wisdom? It says, if you lack wisdom, ask Him. I'm asking.
So was it an administrative thing and why he wasn't mentioned in chapter 20 as opposed to chapter 8?
Who wrote it?
Yeah,
God wrote it.
okay.
God left him out.
Huh.
He apparently was not administering righteously like he had done
Oh,
earlier,
okay.
right?
Makes
And God
sense.
chose not to list him as one of the important people now.
Okay.
There's the contrast, you know, between how he was listed in chapter 8, right, glowingly, to chapter 20, his name is absent. I mean, I think that just tells you everything you need to know. You know, and you look at all the stuff, the decisions he's making at this point, right? And it all started with what?
Sheba.
Lust for a woman. Another man's wife. And been a downhill slide for him ever since. Right?
People just don't learn.
Nope. Nope. Sure enough. Well, any other comments about this particular section? Okay.